This is your Wednesday Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. Lots of good stuff to get to today. Sarah McLellan, Star Tribune Wild beat writer, will join me here in just a minute. Got to talk through Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. Didn't have a chance to get to that last week because we had a whole set of special edition episodes. So Sarah's going to help us kind of understand her level of surprise with those buyouts last week and set up the expansion draft, which is tonight. So looking forward to that conversation with Sarah McLellan. Also have a little bit of Aaron Rodgers updating to get to because that's one of my favorite subjects. You know that, guys. So we'll get to that at the end of the show as well. But first, what did I miss? Got to spend the first few minutes here on the Bucks. Bucks do it. A Midwest city in a mid-market has won the NBA title thanks to, in large part, to the number 15 overall pick in the 2013 NBA draft. Just kind of goes to show, Giannis Antetokounmpo back then didn't know what he was going to become. Nobody really could have known that, envisioned that. You see pictures of him 8 years ago. He looks skinny, smaller, and then he comes in and scores 50 points in Game 6 of the NBA Finals. Bucks win 105-98. You can't help but feel good for Giannis and for the Bucks, and even Bucks fans. I mean, we've talked about that this a couple days ago. The Bucks are the rare Wisconsin team that I have a hard time mustering any sort of distaste for. I think a lot of Minnesota fans are in the same boat. Not all of you, because I wrote about it the other day, and some of you expressed some pushback. But, it's just kind of a cool thing. It's hard to not like the way they play. It's almost impossible to root against Giannis because of what he's, the work he's put in to become the player he is. And again, 50 points, I think 14 rebounds, 5 blocks to win a championship. That shows you everything you need to know about him. So kudos to the Bucks. Congrats to Bucks fans. And I'm trying not to spend too much time on revisionist history here, but just to remember, he was picked number 15 overall in the 2013 draft. The Timberwolves, after trading the number 9 pick, had picks 14 and 21 made for them by Utah, essentially. They made the number 9 pick for Utah, swapped that for 14 and 21. They picked Trey Burke for Utah. C.J. McCollum was picked right after that at number 10. Not going to get into that right now. Giannis was picked at number 15 right after Utah picked Shabazz Muhammad for the Wolves. Some revisionist history there. You never could have known what was going to happen, but man, oh man, it's hard not to think about what might have happened if things had turned out differently back then. As it is, they turned out like this. Bucks are champs. We'll see if this provides any inspiration for the Timberwolves. Another mid-market, Midwest team trying to break through after so many years of not succeeding.
I'm Chris Hine, Timberwolves beat writer at the Star Tribune and the first 5-time guest in daily delivery history. Thank you for listening to this podcast. This work is made possible by our Star Tribune subscribers. For unlimited access to the articles mentioned in this podcast, our coverage of Minnesota sports from pros to preps, and even all of Rand's future blog posts about how the Timberwolves should trade for players they will never get, go to startribune.com/subscribe.
Happy to be joined on Daily Delivery today by Sarah McLellan. Does a great job covering the Wild for the Star Tribune. We were doing a series of kind of pre-planned shows last week. Did not necessarily anticipate, Sarah, the big news that came out of Wild, the Wild orbit that you cover, talking, of course, about both Zach Parise and Ryan Suter getting bought out of their contracts last week. So I thought we could catch up on that quite a bit. So first off, Sarah, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm good. You're kind of, I don't know if you have a leisurely summer, but whatever you had planned last week was probably interrupted a little bit by the Wild comings and goings. You're probably going to get back into it a little bit already because expansion draft and the draft are coming up this week already. We'll talk about both of those things, but maybe right from the jump here, I feel like we've talked about Ryan Suter and Zach Parise in tandem just naturally because they came in at the same time. They had the identical contracts, the joint press conference, and as it turns out, they're leaving at the same time too. That said, I want to take each individually as I ask you, let's start with Zach Parise, kind of on a scale of 1 to 10, what was your surprise level of him getting bought out last week?
You know what? Maybe right in the middle, around a 5. We've talked too, especially earlier in the season or in the year when he started to kind of look like he was getting phased out of the lineup. He'd fallen down to the 4th line. His minutes were dropping. And then, he didn't even start the playoffs. He was a healthy scratch at times, including at the start of that first round series against Vegas. Now when you look back, that looked like perhaps the writing on the wall that maybe he didn't have a future with this team. I always, kind of looked at the contract as what would maybe keep him here, even if he played a role that was different than what he did in the past. The cap charge, which we're now seeing in a buyout, it can escalate quickly and be kind of cumbersome for future spending, for future roster maneuvering. And, I just wasn't sure if that's something that, this management team would take on to cut ties and move on with him. So I could kind of see, okay, well, it didn't look like maybe he had a spot in this team, in this lineup moving forward, but it is a hefty price tag to buy him out. So I'd say my surprise level was, kind of in the middle there. I could see it, but yet that's still a decision that, like you said, has some, repercussions. The fallout will be felt for many years to come. So definitely more surprised with Ryan Suter. That was definitely that was not a 5.
I want to get to that in a minute. Just a couple more thoughts on Parise. I think my surprise level was maybe a tiny bit lower than that. I thought something was going to happen with him, kind of like you said, the writing on the wall during the season. I thought maybe I'm sure they explored every other avenue that's out there in terms of trade and things like that, or trying to figure out a role. And we can kind of get into, after I ask you about Suter, we can kind of get into the why of this, the why now, and the decision that Bill Guerin, in tandem with plenty of other folks, including a sign off from ownership, which is not an easy thing to get, why that happened now. Ryan Suter, however, I think I talked to Patrick Royce a little bit about this a couple of days ago on the show. It's kind of one of those moves that only makes even a tiny bit of sense after it happens. You're like, okay, it's a clean break. That said, he's a defenseman who is still playing a lot of minutes, was one of their top 2-3 defensemen this season, didn't have a huge drop off in his game yet. What's the level of surprise that he is also part of this buyout that becomes a joint buyout?
Yeah, definitely closer to an 8. I would say 8 or a 9, because of the reasons you mentioned. He still had a key role for this team. He was still on the top pairing next to Jared Spurgeon. He was still playing, the hefty minutes that we're used to seeing him playing, and playing in key situations, late in games, power play. He still was very much intertwined in the operation of the Wild. So I think that's kind of where the surprise element came in. And especially too now to kind of kick off this revision of this blue line, which this top 4 has been here for so long. It's been part of its identity. It's just kind of been this foundation. And I think, whenever teams think about the Wild the last few years, whatever's happening with the offense or the goaltending, that top 4 is solid, and that top 4 is a very workable foundation. And now it's, under construction, and that has to be, addressed, and there's holes that need to be plugged. So an area that for so long provided so much stability is now probably the off-season focus, which is just unusual. It's just different. It just hasn't been the case, with a Suter as part of the, the headlining package of this blue line. So that one was more surprising, but you're right. I think when you do kind of start to look at the math, and, it is unique because they arrived together and they left together, but just the way these contracts were, they were identical, the timing, this is where they're getting the most cap relief is together right now, approximately $10 million, roughly $5 million from each. And that $10 million, this summer could really, be valuable, as opposed to maybe in a couple years when it shrinks and there really isn't much flexibility, and there's an opportunity then for some more younger players to maybe get involved. Maybe by then, the Marco Rossi's and the Matt Boldy's of this organization start to take on an increased role, and, we'll see who gets drafted, this year. But, right now with contract negotiations and obviously needing to dip into free agency, you can see why 5 million maybe didn't cut it, but maybe 10 million is a number that, okay, this is the flexibility the team needs to really start to, make some changes, and changes that can sustain it for when there isn't much spending room left, in a couple of years when those cap charges escalate, to be as flexible with its roster.
Do you get a sense, whether it's from, reporting in the last week or reporting over the course of the last year or two, especially since Bill Guerin came in, is there one thing that you think that was the kind of the lead item in this decision? Is it the cap flexibility and needing that right now? Is it worry about, further decline in their games and, not having as much of a role for them to the point where, the amount they're paying them wouldn't be close to worth it? Is it the idea of, this kind of evolution of the leadership within the organization on the ice, and, the evolution kind of away from this old guard that was, primarily led by the Parise Suter, generation, more into, the Fiala, Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, Spurgeon kind of era? Like, is there one thing that you think trumps all others, or is this kind of a move made with a lot of different pieces in mind, expansion draft included, in wanting to protect other certain players too, because those guys had the no move clauses?
Yeah, I think expansion. Yeah, that's the other point I was going to make. So I do feel it's kind of the compilation. It's kind of the perfect storm. And, maybe if there was an expansion, or if there was, if you take away all these factors, maybe the decision is different. But I think it is kind of the sum of the parts that really came to a head here. Like we kind of talked about the math and the finances of it, and the fact that this was the year where, the cap space, for a buyout, looking down the road in these 8 years now that there'll be a charge, this was when it was maximized. Then you look back to what Parise's role was and how that obviously diminished during the season. And I think too, on the flip side, when opportunity was given, to different players or younger players, they were getting more of a role. They accepted that and did well with that. If Joel Eriksson Ek didn't shine like he did the last season in an increased role, maybe the Wild isn't at this crossroads of handing more responsibility to younger players. But they have that evidence now, right? And Nico Sturm came up and played, very steady fourth line minutes for this team, and he wasn't a regular last season. So that, I think that is like, okay, that's an example of what can happen when there is kind of a shift in the responsibility. But the cap charge, the expansion, if there isn't an expansion draft and they don't have to figure out which players to save and protect from Seattle and who could potentially, leave. And if it's someone like a Matt Dumba who didn't have the no movement clause in his deal, like the other defensemen that obviously needed to be protected, what if? I just think it's the compilation of all those factors that makes sense that this was the timing, because this wasn't, there was an expansion. If, young players didn't take over this season, if it didn't end on an optimistic note, even in a Game 7 loss, would the circumstances be different? Would it have been kind of that perfect storm to continue this evolution like you alluded to? I think that's also what's very clearly going on now. If there was any confusion, it's been cleared up. This is a team that is in transition. And having said that, I still don't think it's changed the expectations, but it's clearly changing. And, this was obviously the most impactful, meaningful change in this process so far.
I think there's been plenty of evidence that, Ryan Suter was pretty tight with Craig Leopold, the owner of the Wild, over the years, which is part of what made this even more surprising to me. That said, what do you think this move tells us about Bill Guerin, the general manager, kind of the clout he has already earned, in making this plan and presenting this and executing it, and B, just that he would kind of have the guts, I guess, to be bold like this. What do you think this tells us about him and how this sets up the rest of his tenure?
Yeah, I don't think he's been shy about, coming in here and making changes that he deems necessary. If you remember back, that first half of the season, even into the second half of his first season, not much changed.
Right.
He really did take his time to evaluate. It wasn't just come in and tear everything down. It started out kind of slowly. And then obviously the season paused, in the aftermath of the Jason Zucker trade, which was the first major subtraction from this, previous core. The season paused. Obviously the team resurrected in the bubble playoffs. Dean Evanston was, given the security of now becoming the head coach instead of the interim head coach. And ever since then, and I think his tenor and his comments after those bubble playoffs last August kind of set the stage now for what we're seeing. He was very clear that things have to change, and you can't expect different results if you're doing the same thing and it's not working. So I kind of remember back, he kind of sounded much like he has ever since then, in being bold and being just, like no nonsense about it. Not ho-hum, but just like, this is the way it's going to be, like very clear, black and white, about what his job is and what he's going to do to try to turn this team into the contender that it previously hasn't been. And so he's stuck to that script. He hasn't
Right.
wavered. And I think this just further illustrates and hammers home that point that, he's here to try to improve this team. And he's going to do what he thinks is necessary. And it is a new team. Like, if you think back to all the players that have left, would you recognize this team 3-4 years ago? Like, it's completely different. And, I think this is probably the way it's going to continue, until you start to see, the type of consistency or success that leads to a Stanley Cup. I think change is just inevitable.
That's a good point. And that also kind of leads into the next question I had for you, which is, do they get a good amount of cap relief this year, right? About $10 million. A lot of that probably gets eaten up by what we assume will be extensions for Kaprizov, for Fiala. They already did the Eriksson Ek deal, which wasn't terribly cost prohibitive. It seemed like it was relatively friendly for his production. But, as we think about short-term planning, long-term planning, do they have to take a step back to go forward now? How do they kind of make all of these kind of moving pieces fit together in a 1-year, 2-year, 4-year plan while they, have these young players they like, while their core is changing, but, at a certain point, they're going to be carrying, a good, what is it going to be? Probably close to 15-20% of their cap is going to be tied up for a couple years in salaries of guys that aren't here.
Yeah, it's going to be a very telling couple of years. I think for right now, you look at where the roster stands and, you'll see obviously whoever is removed from expansion, that's obviously needs to be addressed. I think right now the focus probably going into the rest of the offseason, especially with free agency at the end of the month, is to fill the holes. Obviously, I don't think, you're going to go out and probably be able to sign somebody super long term because of, like you said, the cap hits that escalate in a couple years. So I think it's just, kind of fill the holes on the roster. You mentioned the two players, Kaprizov and Fiala, that need the long-term deals. But I think then the next phase of this evolution or this plan has to be more integration of younger players. So I think training camp will shed a lot of light on, how ready a Matt Boldy is, a Marco Rossi, because it's not just, you hope prospects work out, you hope you develop homegrown talent. Now it's a necessity. Now you're going to need young players because you're going to need those entry-level contracts that are cheaper than free agent contracts or veteran contracts to be on the books. It's just how the math is going to work. But having said that, I mean, that is the hope. That is part of this. And I think Guerin has always been clear about that too, is that you don't just sign first line centers. You don't just trade for them. You have to develop and draft. So that puts, I think, an emphasis again on this week's entry level draft, getting more young players so they're in a position to be able to help out. But that's the forecasting. That is the plan that I think was probably thought out of, in terms of executing these buyouts and looking to the future. I do think they can find those short-term solutions in free agency, but in another season, or two, it's probably got to be a younger roster. And I think that's also probably that next piece of the puzzle of this team, making the growth and taking that next step, because if these prospects that have been highly touted and, they have that offensive pizzazz that this team's been missing, that might be, the missing piece to help get the team to that next level. If everything else stays the same, if you continue to have steady seasons from the likes of Fiala and Eriksson and Kaprizov, and, the depth in your lineup from the Folignos and the Greenways, and the defense continues to be solid. And we'll see what happens with the goaltending. Cam Talbot's still under contract for a couple more years. So yeah, it is, I think the focus right now is probably short-term, but that long-term view, I think, is still very much on the radar, and it has to be because of the finances of this situation.
I want to talk expansion draft briefly in a moment here, but I got to ask you about Kaprizov too. Maybe we can go back to our levels of 1 to 10. If you're a Wild fan, what's your level of concern about getting something locked up here? I don't feel like he's got a lot of leverage, but until the deal is signed, I feel like nobody is going to say, okay, it's not a done deal until it's a done deal, right?
Yeah, but I do think this is how it kind of goes. Like, not every negotiation is a couple days, like Joel Eriksson was. I mean, if you remember, was it, before Fiala's last contract, he didn't sign till the brink of training camp. He had to get a deal done, and I think might have been announced like the day before players reported. I think he might have been a late arrival. So like this happens. They do get stretched out. And I think also with everything else that's been going on, you can see how the calendar gets busy for the Wild with the buyouts, figuring out its protection list for expansion draft, obviously preparation for the entry-level draft, free agency forecasting. Not that it's not a priority, because it clearly is, but I wouldn't stress too much about the fact, if I was a fan, that this isn't done yet. He's important. You want that security and knowing. But having said that, Fiala isn't signed either.
No.
So, so it's like, okay, well, maybe this is the way that it goes. Those two need the contracts. And, I know it's mid, almost, getting closer to the end of July, but, it's still approximately 2 months before camp. So it's been a kind of a unique off season with, the Stanley Cup getting awarded later than usual, and the extra event of the expansion draft. I guess as a fan, I wouldn't read too much into, the timing of it all. A lot's going on, but still I can understand that there's, an urgency and, a clarity that fans want. Just to know that he's here, he's back in the mix, and it then obviously gives a little bit more definition to what planning the Wild can do moving forward.
You mentioned expansion. I like that too. Is there, with the expansion draft, Seattle getting to pick its players Wednesday night, the Kraken, release the Kraken. We'll see who they pick. Is there an expected outcome as it relates to the Wild? Do we have any kind of guesses as to, who they might lose in this round of expansion?
I could definitely see it coming down to, obviously, Capo Kakinen and Carson Soucy. I think those are the most intriguing players the Wild made available. Kakinen, especially coming off just a steady rookie season in net, to go on that 9-0 winning streak, and to just kind of look as calm, cool, and collected as he did in net when, he probably got assignments he wasn't expecting when Cam Talbot wasn't available. I think that could be appealing for Seattle, especially, with his contract situation. He just has 1 year left. He's, at under $1 million for a cap hit. And then, he's an RFA that they could negotiate with. The goaltending, I think, to me is probably the most interesting position that, Seattle has to deliberate because of who's available, because Montreal exposed Carey Price, and some other veteran names. I know obviously Ben Bishop and Jonathan Quick haven't been, headliners in the league in recent years, but they were at one point. And so I think there's curiosity there. It sounds like Chris Dreiger from Florida is probably going to be part of their goaltending tandem moving forward, based on reports around the league. But that's fascinating. And, you could take on, if you're Seattle, a Kakkonen and put him as your backup, or, let him develop there and continue what he's doing with the Wild. With Susie, I think he's also someone who'd be very appealing with the way he's started his career, just, an effective defenseman lower on your blue line. He has size. I think he can bring a little bit of that sandpaper element to his game. And he has a very workable contract. He's under contract with a cap hit, less than $3 million, which, if Seattle obviously is paying a lot of attention to where they're doling out their dollars, as a kickoff for this franchise, to get somebody in that, that price range who can play in your top six, that's probably worth a long look. So to me, those are two players that, are probably getting a lot of, evaluation from Seattle. And I think either loss obviously creates another hole for the Wild. If Kakkonen's gone, they'd have to go out and find a new backup for next season. And if Susie's gone, it's another subtraction from a blue line that just, moved on from Ryan Suter. Mm-hmm. So that's even more in flux. So it's going to be a lot of, read and reaction from the Wild, and could obviously add another item to the shopping list for free agency later this month.
Absolutely. And the regular draft is this weekend. Obviously, a lot of those players don't contribute for a while. Really enjoyed your story in today's paper about the prospect coming up, likely first round pick. And anything else coming up that you want to promote before we get out of here, draft wise or otherwise?
Yeah, you're right. So expansion is Wednesday night, and then the entry-level draft kicks off Friday and continues Saturday. The first round Friday is going to be intriguing, I think. The Wild has 2 first-round picks, which I believe has happened only one other time in its franchise history, that it ended up drafting 2 players in the first round. That could change. A trade could happen. We'll see, obviously, if they actually hold on and make those picks. Right now they're at 22 and 26, but they're technically 21 and 25 because the 11th overall pick has been vacated by Arizona. So yeah, I think that's going to be interesting. You look back last draft and, the team obviously acquired quite a few centers to kind of bolster that position. I think obviously talent trumps need, and the best player available is usually the philosophy, but it'll still be interesting to see if there are any trends that maybe emerged in the players that they draft, in terms of, maybe solidifying a goalie down the road if Kakkonen is no longer available, or do they try to, add a few more defensemen? I think obviously, like I said, it's usually best player available regardless of position, but those trends usually start to kind of emerge, by day 2. You can kind of see, okay, there's, a lot more X position in the pipeline now. So I think that'll be interesting to watch, especially having that second first round pick from Pittsburgh from the Jason Zucker trade. It gives them probably a little bit more, flexibility to see what's out there and see if there's maybe a deal to be made. So that'll be something to watch for sure.
Well, looking forward to that for sure. Follow Sarah's coverage, Star Tribune, startribune.com. Sarah McLellan, thanks so much for joining me here again today, and I'm sure we'll catch up. I don't know what could be newsier than Suter and Parise getting bought out, but you never know. It's a long off season.
Sounds good. Take care.
You too. Let's end with the cooler. Aaron Rodgers reportedly turned down a contract extension from the Packers that would have made him the highest paid quarterback and therefore the highest paid player in the NFL sometime this offseason. That's an Adam Schefter report. He turned it down. Not entirely sure why. Schefter's speculating that it's, that makes it clear that it's not about the money. It would have added a couple of years to his deal, would have, kept him in Green Bay for 5 seasons. Which would have taken him well into his 40s in Green Bay. He didn't want that. So where does that leave things? It's a good question, but training camp opens in a week, you guys. We're 1 week away from getting even more clarity on this situation, and I'm looking forward to that very, very much. That'll do it for today. We'll be back tomorrow. Chris Hine is going to be on, talk a little NBA, some Timberwolves. Got some Ben Simmons debate, got some trade talk going because Chris and I love to do that. Friday, I'll have Randy Johnson on the show talk Gopher football. It's media day on Thursday for the Gophers, so a lot of expectations there. Thanks for joining me here today. We'll catch you again tomorrow.